We're in the middle of Matthew chapter 26, and there are so many details about what happened in Jesus' life at this last period of time, and they're given here in Matthew. We read this a lot of the details in Mark, Luke, and John too, and a little different view is given. And some people have a little problem with that as far as some of the accounts are a little bit different. But let me give you this as just a background. I know there's two accounts of Jesus coming to Jericho in the book of Mark and the book of Luke, and there was blind men that were healed. And in one of the Gospels, it says Jesus was, as he was leaving Jericho, he came to some blind men. In the other Gospel, it says as Jesus was approaching Jericho, he came to some blind men. And so it's like, well, what was he doing? Leaving Jericho or approaching Jericho? And that's one of those things where, it's to me, it's good because it's like the personal view of the writer of the Gospels. And because in that day there was two Jerichos, it's like we live in an area where we've got Old Shawneetown and New Shawneetown. And depending on what you're looking at, you could tell somebody, well, they were leaving Shawneetown or they were going to Shawneetown. Because when you leave Old Shawneetown and head west, you go to New Shawneetown. And so depending on the person's perspective, what they consider most important, Old Shawneetown or New Shawneetown, it could be you're leaving Shawneetown or you're approaching Shawneetown. And so that's the same kind of thing it was in the Gospels. And so what we see in the accounts here of the details around Jesus' life at the end was, we're getting accounts from individuals and, who they heard the story from or what they saw, their personal accounts or who gave them personal accounts. And so we get a little different details on some of them. And some people that bothers a lot. That doesn't really bother me. I like it. It gives the personal flavor. And we'll look at one of those things here in just a bit here, and even in chapter 26, if I get that far. Well, here in verse 30, it says, after Jesus told them about the Passover and explained it to them and gave them what we now call the Lord's Supper, with just the breaking of the bread and the drinking of the cup, it's like those two things being his body and his blood. It says in verse 30, after singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And so here's this, they're out there, and once again, verse 31, it says, then Jesus said to them, you will all fall away because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered. And once again, here we go back, and he's quoting an Old Testament verse. Once again, I think this one's out of Zechariah also, and showing that it's fulfillment of his life. This is over and over in these last few chapters. There's those accounts that come back and the references to the Old Testament and all of that because Jesus is the fulfillment that all of this has been looking for. And we went through the whole Old Testament. It's all been looking toward this. This is what it's all been about. And so he's saying that they're all going to scatter from him. They're going to leave when the crunch time comes. Verse 32, but after I've been raised, I will go before you to Galilee. Here he already gives the plan. After I'm raised, what do you mean raised? So once again, it's his resurrection, the crucifixion, the resurrection. He's already talking about it beforehand. So he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. And it says in verse 36, then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, that's James and John, and began to be grieved and distressed. Then he said to them, my soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me. And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as thou wilt. So here we see the humanity of Jesus probably more than maybe any other passage in the Scriptures. Is one, he's deeply grieved over the fact that he's going to have to go and be crucified, carry the weight of the sin of the world, go through the distress and just the physical things that are going to be done to his body. And then he actually says it in prayer to God the Father, if it's possible, I don't want to go through this. If it's possible, if there's another way. But then he says, but nevertheless, whatever has to be done, whatever's your will in this. And of course, the Father's will is there had to be a sacrifice for sin, and Jesus is the only one who qualifies. So that's what happened here, is that he qualified to be the sacrifice, and so it's let's go ahead with this. We see in verse 40, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And said to Peter, so you men could not keep watch with me for 1 hour? And most of us in this generation would say, 1 hour, especially in the Western world, you can't pray for 1 hour. What would you say? I'd get tired. I wouldn't know what to say for an hour anyway. And we would be sympathizing with Peter. And then he says this in verse 41, keep watching and praying that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Now, that's one of the most quoted portions of Scripture in the Bible, I think, by people say, well, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And it's when we're making an excuse for why we couldn't do something. You know, well, the spirit's willing, but the flesh is weak. Well, this wasn't given as an excuse. This was given as a warning. You know, keep watch that you not enter into temptation, because the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And so he's saying, you've got to watch out for yourselves in this situation, because you could very easily fall into temptation if you're not prepared, spiritually for this. So skipping down here, he finally, in verse 47, it says, and while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, came up, accompanied by a great multitude with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now he who was betraying him gave them a sign, saying, whomever I shall kiss, he is the one, seize him. And immediately he went to Jesus and said, hail, Rabbi, and kissed him. There's what a way of deceit and, of betrayal. And, I heard of a tribe in, I can't remember what it was, South America, Central America, but there was a group of natives in that area, native to that region, and they dwelled in they really exalted the idea of deceit. And actually, so when they heard this presentation of the gospel, Judas kind of became like a hero. Like, wow, betray him with a kiss? That was really great, But what a thing of friendship betrayal, you greet him, oh, Rabbi, teacher, trying to show honor, and then you kiss him, to show this is the one that you need to take and crucify. So we see a horrendous betrayal here on the part of Judas. And so moving down, then it says in verse 51, and behold, one of those who were with Jesus reached and drew out his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Here's an interesting, that account is in, I think, all 4 Gospels. And in 3 of the Gospels, it just says, behold, one of those, one of the guys among Jesus' followers. But it's interesting to me that John says, now Peter took the sword. Now, this is one where I'm wondering about personality, Peter and John. Peter got a lot of the big preaching moments and kind of the highlight moments. John called himself the disciple whom Jesus loved, the beloved disciple. I wonder if how much of the personality comes out in the writing of the Gospels. Was John like, everybody else was trying to protect Peter, and John's like, it was Peter. Peter took the sword out and cut off the guy's ear. And so what's interesting here is, I wonder, was there maybe just a little bit of competition still or something, or just like, Peter, he keeps doing these things, Why isn't he more like me? Anyway, I don't know. That's just totally an Ed thing. Don't put any credibility to that. In verse 52, then it says, then Jesus said to him, put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. Here's a real key. It's one of those things that gives us a spiritual truth that we can understand. Now, he says, put the sword away, because if you use the sword, you're going to perish by the sword. It's interesting as we look at the life of David in the Old Testament, King David, when he had a chance to overthrow Saul, he understood this principle. He understood that if he overthrew Saul by force, he would be overthrown by force. If he would, take Saul's kingdom apart from God's timing, then his kingdom would likely be taken apart from God's timing. He who uses the sword shall perish by the sword. So David, in his day, he decided he was going to wait for God's time, and he did, and it came. It was a tough time, and David went through great trials, even distressed, and even joined the other team for a little while. But he understood this principle that he who uses the sword shall perish by the sword. And Jesus explained, hey, I could defend myself if I needed to. You don't need to take your sword and do it right now. But in order for the scriptures to be fulfilled, I need to go through this process.